Welcome to our closing event of our 25th Annual Jewish Book Festival, sponsored again by the Jewish Federation of the Greater San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys. I'm Deborah Noble, co-chairing this event with Linda Mazer. I would like to say thank you to everyone on the committee. Thank you to the Jewish Federation and its staff. And I wanted to say that while our Jewish Book Festival is celebrating its 25th year, the Jewish Federation is celebrating its 30th year of bringing our community together through innovative programs like the Jewish Book Festival, PJ Library, the Cultural Arts Program, and Camp Gan Shalom, as well as serving as the Jewish voice of our large community. Our Federation is planning a number of special 30th anniversary programs this year, including a celebration brunch on June 23rd to honor our past presidents, celebrate our 30 years, and look forward to our next 30. And now, it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's author. Natasha Lance Rogoff is a TV producer and an award-winning documentary filmmaker. After moving to Russia in 1982 to study Russian language at Leningrad State University, she published articles in major Western press and produced TV programs about the Soviet underground culture, including the persecution of Russian rock musicians and the LGBTQ+ community. Things that are all too relevant today. During the 1988 Reagan-Gorbachev Moscow Summit, she served as a special consultant to NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw, and in 1989, she joined Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Hedrick Smith to produce an award-winning PBS television series, Inside Gorbachev's USSR. She then embedded for 2 years with Russian hardliners for her documentary Russia for Sale, The Rough Road to Capitalism, which aired nationally on PBS and was featured on ABC's Nightline with Ted Koppel on the night the Soviet Empire fell. Just after her return to the US, Lance Rogoff joined the then Children's Television Workshop to bring Sesame Street to Russia, which she's going to tell you about this evening. As executive producer of Ulice Sesame, she led a team of hundreds of Moscow and American artists. Her book, Muppets in Moscow, The Unexpected Crazy True Story of Making Sesame Street in Russia, has received awards from the Benjamin Franklin Independent Book Publishers Association and the Independent Publishers Book Awards, and she has been shortlisted for the prestigious Pushkin House Book Prize for Best Nonfiction Writing About Russia. We're going to hold questions until after her presentation, and if you are joining us on Zoom, just go to the Q&A tab at any time during her presentation to type the questions in, and we'll take them after her presentation. Natasha, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to the presentation.
Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here tonight, and thank you all for coming out on a Saturday night. I had a chance to visit Old Pass yesterday with Debbie and Linda Mazer, and it's a beautiful town. I haven't been here before and had never visited the Rose Bowl, so it was a wonderful time to start to get to know your town. I wanted to thank the JCC of Pasadena and all the wonderful people I've worked with to make this day possible, Linda, Debbie, and Rebecca Russell, and also the Jewish Book Network for supporting authors like me. It has been amazing the last week since October 7th, going around the country to places that I've never been in the United States, and speaking with Jewish communities who have been dealing with battling with the anti-Semitism that they're dealing with in their own communities and on campuses. So it's wonderful to be together with you tonight. I wanted to start by asking, how many people here have been to Russia? Oh, it's a lot. And what about to Ukraine? And how many people know that Sesame Street has an original Russian language version with its own original Slavic style Muppets and its own neighborhood? Okay, a few people. Well, to set the scene of this story, it's a remarkable story set in the 1990s, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I wanted to give you a feel for what the time period was like, as well as what the show looks like, because I'm going to be talking about it and it's a visual medium. So if we could roll the slide number 3, that would be great.
Is to create a program that has never existed here before, which introduces children into the world of learning in a very joyful way and makes them understand that they can achieve anything that they want to in the future.
Our kids have to share something. Let them share not Terminator, not Rambo, which is now the case, but Sesame Street.
So as you can see, many of the problems that we faced in the 1990s continued to persist, both in Russia and in US-Russian relations. What's been fascinating about the last year since the book came out has been crisscrossing the US as well as being in Europe 3 times, meeting with many people who had been fighting the repressive regime under the early years of the Soviet Union, then after the period of the thaw and the opening, and then into Putin's era. And many of these people have had to flee in the past year since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So many of my former colleagues, artists, they had been protesting the war, they had been speaking out on social media, and as part of writing this book, I had been keeping in touch with them on WhatsApp. So before the war, I had tracked them down after 30 years, and the conversations continue to be unbelievable in terms of what they're reporting about their friends, both who are staying in Russia and those who are in Ukraine still. The period that we were creating this children's television show was a time of incredible instability. As you can see, there was enormous violence. There was a breakdown of the center of the government. So it was kind of a lawless place with no rule of law. The medical system had collapsed. There was enormous poverty for ordinary Russians. And this period of time, why it's interesting to look back now. And when I wrote the book, I never expected, this is my first book. I'm a filmmaker, for my entire life. And the way that period of time resonates with the present has really astounded many readers. And I have Russians coming up to me and telling me about this, and Ukrainians and Georgians. Because when you're making a program about children, this is a way to get into a society that's so intimate. When people are talking about their children, their hopes and their dreams for their future, of their children and their country, it's very different than the experience that I had making documentary films in Russia for 10 years before Sesame Street hired me. And the very idea of Sesame Street, taking Sesame Street to Russia, started in 1992 with then Senator Biden, who imagined that the Muppets would be ideal ambassadors to, bring idealistic values of tolerance, compassion, and peace, to tens of millions of children and their families across the former Soviet Union. The show was intended to be broadcast all across the 11 time zones of the former USSR, because at that point, all of those communities were still educated in Russian, speaking Russian, and even as recently as 2014, Vladimir Zelensky's TV show, which was a comedy, was also broadcast in Russian. So the idea was that we would be able to provide skills to this community that would help young children thrive in a new open society. And when Sesame Street executives approached me, they came to the screening in New York City of my last film, which Debbie had mentioned. It was called Russia for Sale: The Rough Road to Capitalism. And I had spent 2 years embedded with hardline conservatives who were doing everything they could to prevent the USSR from falling, from ending. So these executives watched the film and then came up to me afterwards and said, we've been trying to bring Sesame Street to Russia. We may have congressional support for this with Senator Biden and Senator Bradley's assistance, but we need somebody who understands Russia. And I said to them, well, did you just watch my film? Because, I don't see how that film, what any of this has to do with the Muppets. And I said, I looked very confused, and I said, I don't have children. I don't know anything about children or children's television, and I'm not even sure I like children. I was single, just turned 30, and I just thought this was a crazy idea. But they were very persuasive, and I went down to Sesame Street's headquarters opposite Lincoln Center in New York, and I walked out of the elevator, and there was, giant Big Bird and Elmo painted on the walls, and all these young people who were running around. They were so earnest and trying to change the world for the better. And then the executives that I met with explained to me that the international, Sesame Street International co-productions are not an import. They are programs that are created to reflect the culture and values of the society wherever they're being produced. I thought this was incredibly ambitious, and I was intrigued. In addition to that, I needed a job, and I had just finished my last film, was broke like many independent documentary filmmakers, and I thought, well, I could at least try to do this. And I have to say, I'm so glad that I said yes. I was terrified, but this whole experience changed my life. And then it took me another 30 years to write about it. But I knew at the time that this was a remarkable story that really needed to be told. And once the Putin regime invaded Ukraine, I thought, even more so, the story of these very brave, courageous, and passionate people really needs to be told. So I got to Moscow in 1933, and you have to realize I had already been in Russia for a decade. 1993. And that would be even worse in 1933. So I thought I understood Russia really well, and then I quickly discovered that I had totally underestimated the challenges that we were going to face. Within the first couple of months, we had to match the funding from the U.S. government. So the U.S. government would not release any of the appropriated funds unless it were matched. They were matched dollar for dollar, or ruble to dollar, devaluating ruble by 25% each month. So it was very difficult, and I started having meetings with different businessmen. I worked with my business partner there, who's Russian. There's a lot about him in the book as well. He was a former journalist who wrote the first articles about political prisoners held in psychiatric hospitals. So we would have these meetings, including the first, which was with a businessman, and we're talking about the Muppets and how we're going to, bring Sesame Street to Russia. And he's got this giant fish tank in his office, and there's a shark swimming around in a circle as we're talking about, this philanthropic venture. So, a lot of this was very intimidating. But finally, we were able to get to somebody who I'm sure many of you have heard of, but he was a very powerful oligarch named Boris Berezovsky, who later became the advisor to the Russian president. And he was really intrigued by the idea of the training that we were going to be bringing to the Russian media professionals, because their TV industry, which had been used primarily for propaganda purposes, had really not developed very much. And we had to introduce concepts like shooting with 3 cameras, synchronized sound, as well as writing for comedy. The U.S. had such a long tradition of advertising that our television was that much more sophisticated. So this gentleman, Berezovsky, he was very interested in Big Bird. And as we're talking and I'm explaining to him about, the U.S. Congress is going to support this, and he would be then the sponsor with the Congress, and all he could say to me is Big Bird going to be in the show? And I thought, oh, he seems very focused on Big Bird. We might lose this deal, because Big Bird is not in the international co-productions typically. The idea is that we create new Muppets that will, come out of the ideas of the artists that we're working with. So we talk a little bit more, and he finally listens to, this idea that, there's going to be a real exchange of technology, and he agrees to sponsor the show. So we are thrilled. We are just thrilled. And I go back home and tell my bosses at Sesame Workshop, formerly the Children's Television Workshop, which is a nonprofit. And I just think this is great, because now the appropriated funds will be released and we can now start the production. 3 weeks later, I get a phone call from my business associate who I'd been working with, and he says that Boris's car has been blown up and that Boris is now severely burned, and we are not able to have any follow-up with his lawyers or anything. Whatever was arranged is no longer viable. Boris survives, and he goes on to actually acquire 50% ownership of the Russian TV station, but he has bigger things to worry about now than children's television or Big Bird, and he opts out. So we're back to ground zero. About a year later, we finally found another broadcast partner. This was Vlad Listyev, who was a great man who was trying to bring press freedom to Russia. He was also the host of Russia's Jeopardy, and he was the host of their version of Larry King Live. And he never was afraid to ask very biting questions of former communists, and usually about corruption. So we were all at the studio one night, and he went home after his show was over. And as he came to his home, he was murdered. He was gunned down. And that was another time when I really had to think about if this was at all possible. So all this is going on before we start producing the show. And 9 months later, the next person who was in charge of the TV station was also murdered. This is a man, Oleg Slavienko, who you see there, a very young man who had recently gotten divorced and had a little 9-year-old girl. And I had given him one of the first Tickle Me Elmo dolls that had come off of the production line. And it was just, very unbelievable that here we were trying to create a show that could help the country so much, and the people that we were working with were constantly getting knocked off. But it wasn't only the violence that was challenging for us. It was, most of all, I'd say, what actually kept me in the country as long as I stayed were the incredible cultural clashes that we faced in making this show. And we had, when we were trying to create the Muppets, for instance, and I showed them my colleagues, my creative colleagues. They were Russian, Ukrainian, and I'd show them images from the American Muppets. When I first showed them, they said to me, "Well, those are horrible. We don't like those." And then the chief director said to me, "Natasha, we have a revered puppetry tradition dating back to the 16th century, and we really don't need your American Muppets." Then the head of the live action, I was speaking about this today with Linda, who is, this was our director for live action films. And he said to me, "I don't think that these Muppet-style puppets will go over with our children very well. Because Russians are scientifically predisposed to a different sort of Muppet." And I swear to God, this was the language that was used. And then he said, "And besides, those Muppets won't work because they're naked." So I would say the cultural clashes touch just about every aspect of the production, from the educational content to the script writing, to the music, and even to the set design. So when I want to go back to the Muppets. So what happened after the showing them the Muppets initially? I thought this was just not going to be. There was going to be no resolution to this, and they invited the top Russian puppeteer builder to come and meet with me to try to convince me why they had to include their puppets in the Sesame Street show. So this gentleman, Kolya Komov, walks in with 2 giant sacks, and he pulls out a puppet, from each hand. He puts the puppets on his hands, and they look like this. If we can show the slide. So with each of these puppets, he picks up, one of the puppets picks up a stick and starts beating the other puppet. And my Russian colleagues are all laughing. And I'm just looking at this going, "Oh my God, this is like puppet on puppet violence. This is not gonna go over for Sesame Street." And so eventually they decided that I finally convinced them that, explaining to them that they could create whatever Muppet they wanted, based on their own folklore, their aesthetic. What would they want it to look like? So they drew sketches, and they said, okay, we'd like to base our Muppet, they finally agreed to call it a Muppet in the design process, on a character from Russian folklore who's called Domovoi. And this character is a spirit of the hearth and the home. And this is what he looks like. So I was part of this process, and I took the sketches back to New York and shared them with Jim Henson Productions. And the puppet builder there, Ed Christie, who's a good friend still, and he said, these are terrible. And he said, you've got to go back and talk to them. What about talking about how the Muppets should be playful and, children themselves, so that young children can identify with the characters? So I went back, and before I show you what they ended up coming up with, I wanted to talk about other issues that came up in the beginning of the production, because everything changed by the middle and the end. But we had early scripts that were submitted, which were like, one storyboard was going to teach the letter D, and it had a picture of a older man mopping the floor, and then the letter D came up, and it said D for depression. So, another challenge was the music director, who was a really quite accomplished pianist and composer. And from day one, she insisted that all the music for Улица Sesame, which means Sesame Street in Russian, had to be classical. And I kept thinking, how is this going to work? Because Sesame Street is known for its, innovative, diverse, upbeat music. And that's a feature of the show. That's what makes the show work. So I was actually really worried. But then the team came to the US, and they met with the veteran Sesame Street producers, animators, the puppeteers themselves, and they also visited Sesame Street Studio in Queens. So they met, they saw how big the set was, and they thought this was kind of interesting, but they still weren't convinced that they really wanted to, really, I'd say, commit themselves 100% to the show. So then I took them downtown. I decided it was time for them to have their first lager. And I took them to McSorley's in New York. So we were taking the subway, and when we got out of the subway, there was a group of black teenagers who suddenly came around the group like this, and they were yelling, and none of my colleagues speak English, so I was translating. And these young men said, "Bert and Ernie, my main man." And they started singing songs from Sesame Street. And they started pointing at my jacket. And I realized I was wearing a black bomber jacket with Bert and Ernie embossed on the back. And they saw that from across the street and ran over. So once my Russian colleagues saw that these average Americans were engaging with the show the way they were, suddenly they understood the impact that this show could have on their own country. They were just stunned that people knew about this. I think before that, they were really suspicious of, Muppets, Sesame Street, This American, what's going on here? But that was a transformational moment. And when they came back to Moscow, They created the most exquisite Muppet that many people at Henson think has ever been created. And this is what he looks like. This is Zeli Boba on the left. Maybe it's your right. And he is taller than Big Bird. He's based on Domovoy, the character out of their folklore, because he's a spirit of nature. And to represent that, he has pieces of moss and twigs and leaves sewn into his coat. And he lives inside a 40-foot tree. So he's a remarkable character that really represents the genius artistry of the community of artists that we were working with. And to this day, I meet people who are in their 30s and their 40s who can't stop talking about him. So the other two Muppets, are they still there? Maybe not. Kubik and Businka. Kubik is the orange hand puppet, and the male puppet, who's based on based on a new archetype, which is the entrepreneur, and he's also very much in the tradition of Russian literature because he's a ne'er-do-well. So he is constantly inventing things that already exist, like the clothing line, or just a place where you can hold your socks. And Businka, there's quite a bit about the creation of her in the book because she really broke stereotypes for Russian females, and some of the discussions were very heated over this. So finally, after solving the Muppet stalemate, now that we have the Muppets for Ulica Sesame, we had to decide, what would my colleagues like to teach in this show? What would they like the curriculum to be? And the cornerstone of every Sesame Street International co-production is the curriculum seminar. This is where we bring together educators and teachers from all across the country, education specialists and teachers, and they debate what are going to be the goals of the show. So we held a 3-day seminar at Danilov Monastery, which is the headquarters of the Russian Orthodox Church. And I thought this was an ingenious idea. We're creating this new show. It's so spiritual. And when I talked to the director of research for the Russian team, she said, and I said, this is great that you picked this place. And she said, oh, we just got a good deal on the room. And I thought, but it was amazing because as we're debating, all the monks are walking around in their robes, the priests, and it was truly quite a place. And one of the goals that came up early is, the group felt that it was important to try to teach children skills that they would need to thrive in this new open society, this new free market society as well. It was no longer a command economy, so kids would need to develop certain skills that related to the ability to take risks, taking initiative. Russia had traditionally, in its education, been quite didactic, and most of the discussions focused on how obedience was a priority for so many years. So I raised my hand at some point and said, well, what about having a scenario where children run a lemonade stand? And this idea was met with horror because they said the only people that sell things on the street are criminals and mafia. And this was true up until a few years earlier. You would be put in prison for speculation, which was engaging in independent commerce. And I had actually made films about this. But much like many people in the West, I had made certain assumptions about my team when we were shifting from communism to capitalism. And I leaped at the idea that my colleagues shared a lot of the same ideas that I had having grown up in America with 200 years of democracy. And I learned very quickly that the making of Sesame Street essentially pitted Sesame Street's progressive values against 300 years of Russian thought. One of the ways where I understood how change was going to happen in this country was through a discussion of how we would address inclusivity in Russia, for Ulica Sesame. And, thinking about where we are today, just 2 days ago with Putin declaring the LGBTQ community is an extremist organization, and we will see crackdowns and have already seen crackdowns on these communities in Russia. I think back to this time earlier when we were talking about including children with disabilities in Ulica Sesame. And I showed a video clip from a pretty well-known segment which has a little boy in a wheelchair. It's called Me in My Chair. And it's a little boy in a park, and he's flying a kite. And there's an upbeat song in the background that says, "Me in my chair, we go everywhere." And I'm smiling as I'm watching this video, and then I turn it off, and there's just silence in the room. And then somebody says, "It's so exploitative to show children in wheelchairs on a TV show." Now, this was not what I was expecting as the reaction to this segment. And then another teacher says very innocently, "I don't understand why normal children, normalnie dzieci, would want to watch a TV show with nenormalnie dzieci, not normal children." So even the language, was so painful to my ears in these meetings. And then another teacher says, "I don't think that we should show this because life is so harsh already, and our show should basically free the children from the hell that we live in every day." So I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, maybe they're not ready for Sesame Street. And then a woman says, "What you Americans don't understand," because we had several people there from the workshop from the US as well, is that our medical system is in disarray. And many children who are disabled and stuck in bed without the use of their legs will never get a wheelchair. How will they feel if they see other children in the TV show who have a wheelchair? They'll just feel sad. And none of us had thought about that. So we had a break in the discussion, and when we came back, I really didn't know what was going to happen, because the idea that we were going to make this show and have no children represented with disabilities, I thought, this is wrong too. And then this woman in the back of the room who hadn't spoken yet, Ludmila Chipurina, speaks up and she says, "I work with children every day who have disabilities. I play with them and laugh with them. They yearn to play with normal children." She uses the word normal again, which is standard. She tells the group, "I think we have a responsibility to include these children and to show them as a valuable part of society. That's why we're here in this room today. When she finishes speaking, and she tells the group that the region that she works in, which is Cheboksary, has the highest rate of children with disabilities because it was used as a chemical dumping ground for hazardous materials during the Soviet times. So after she finishes speaking, I look around the room, and about half of the people are crying. And I'm crying too. What ended up happening next is the entire group decided that they needed to include children with disabilities. And they understood the role that the show could have in changing their country and the attitudes of people in their country towards children with disabilities. And this change happened without my saying a single word. That's how I learned how change happens in this country, by listening and letting the process happen. There was another area that taught me a lot about understanding Russia. And the reason why I bring up these stories is because it's so important for us to understand this period of time, because the 1990s feature in Putin's narrative every day when he's giving speeches. He talks about this period of time, and he brings in themes that are present today, such as Russian nationalism, Russian pride, a sense that the West is out to destroy Russia, and a sense of Russian cultural superiority. We dealt with all of these themes in the making of this children's puppet show. And it is phenomenal to see how that it still resonates today. At the same time, I think about the people who were able to change, so many people, and embrace ideas of inclusivity. But everything took time. There was no way to expect the country to change quickly. And I think that's a great deal what we did at the beginning of this transition. There's I'm just checking time for a sec. I just wanted to say that there's, people often ask me, what happened with the show? The show went on to become a national hit. It aired on Russia's 2 top TV stations simultaneously, and it went on for 10 years, well into Putin's era. It educated tens of millions of children. And since the war broke out in Ukraine, I was in Europe 3 times, meeting with Russians, Ukrainians, Russians who left, Ukrainians who left. And it's been phenomenal hearing their stories. Someone I met at a deli in, London, who was Georgian and told me that she had grown up on the show. Another woman who had left right after the war with her 2 children from Ukraine. And she said she started crying and saying, it was, thank you for making this, but it was such a vision of how our country could have been. But what gives me solace, and continues to do so over these last months, I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning one time. This was just when the first 1 million of Russians were leaving because they didn't support the war and they didn't want to fight. And I realized that they had, if they were in their 30s and 40s, they had all grown up on Ulica Sesame. And then as I was sitting there staying awake at night, just thinking about what was going on, I realized that the people fighting in Ukraine, who are many of them in their 30s and 40s, which is shocking, and that they're still fighting. And they also are the Ulica Sesame generation. So when I was back in Moscow in January of 2020 for the last time and interviewing my colleagues for this book, I spoke to the chief director of the show, who's now in his 80s. And I said to him, well, what do you think? What do you think can happen? Do you have any hope? And he said, I do have hope. I have hope that the Ulica Sesame generation can stop this madness. And with that, let's open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Let's see, Rebecca, you're going to field questions from Zoom? Okay. All right. Go ahead. Yeah, Elliot? Okay, yeah. Do you want to get the mic from here? No, not on Zoom. Okay.
Oh, Zoom. I just wanted to ask if you had questions with translating. I guess your Russian is good enough that you trusted their translating, were there issues like that?
Yes, I speak Russian fluently, and we had everybody on our team spoke Russian. The people who didn't, who came from Sesame Workshop, they all had translators. So that was how we did that show. That's not the case in every international co-production, but in this case it was really critical because most of our team, like probably 98%, didn't speak English.
The studio was an Ort studio, and I wondered if Ort had anything to do with the production, because I've been active in Ort for many years, and I would be very interested to know that. We actually produced the entire show without a broadcast partner, and part of agreeing to work on the show, I had asked Sesame Workshop to let us work independent of the formerly Russian and communist-controlled TV station. So the idea was that, the underground rock musicians that I had known for years earlier, and filmmakers who'd been persecuted under communism, that they would all be able to come in and work on this show. So we had people both from the TV station who were former employees of ORT, and then we also had a majority of independent people. We also pulled in people from Gorky Film Studios and Mosfilm because there was no film production being done at the time because the state was not financing film production. And then we had many people from theater, from Moscow's top theaters. Our set designer had never built a set before for a TV show. We have some photos from the set, which I was going to show at the end, which we could quickly show too. So the set itself, when the set designer went to build the show, to design it, the set, she said, I told her, you have complete free reign. Go do what you'd like to do, and she came back with an empty, pad. And I said, "What's the problem? What's happening?" And she said, "I don't know if I'm building a set that is supposed to look like pre-revolutionary Russia, Russia of the Soviet recent past, or some new Russia that we don't know what it looks like yet. And what she ended up doing was combining all the architectural, historical periods of Russia into one set and created a giant scrim that had Russian Orthodox churches, the concrete buildings that Khrushchev built, the Stalinist buildings, and we had representations of those different structures on the set itself.
You seem to have several business partners and people that you were working with in the book. One of them that I found fascinating was Irina, and
Yes.
who seemed kind of like a modern day Zsa Zsa Gabor. And I just wanted to know sort of how that worked, because she sounded like somebody who was kind of advancing the process and then 2 steps back, and it just seemed kind of a big roller coaster. If you could talk about how she sort of influenced the production and your process.
Absolutely. She's one of my favorite characters in the book and one of my favorite people who I saw in January. I still talk to her on the phone. I first met her. She ran advertising, one of the only women who was running an advertising company in Moscow. And I met her, she walked in wearing like a fur red coat. It wasn't real fur, I don't think, but it was, red shoes. She was absolutely divine. And we had no idea if she had the money or not to be the sponsor for the show. And we really didn't actually know that even when we finished the production, and until months after the show aired. But that wasn't her fault. Her heart was in the show, and she had an 8-year-old daughter, and she was doing it for her daughter and really for the children of Russia. But I think the problem was that the Russian government and the tax office would constantly freeze the accounts that people held. And so, it was impossible to, there were also no Western banks in Moscow at this time. So trying to run a production like that under these circumstances with a devaluating ruble, and if you brought any Western currency into the country, it was immediately converted into rubles, was on a level of, impossibility that when I look back on how we managed this, I just can't even think that it was possible.
There are many different ethnic groups in Soviet Russia and today's Russia. Was there any treatment of those ethnic groups? And my second question is, what music did you ultimately use?
So that's a great question. The group did include elements of nationality culture from the different former republics. And that was very important to them. They weren't able to change the language in the show because it was hard enough to make the show even in Russian. So we brought in music and arts from the other former republics. And that's how that was dealt with in season 1, which lasted 2 years. And your second question was music. So the music was the music of this show is amazing. And I wish we could play some of it, because there is some, you can hear it. If you type in Ulitsa Sesame into Google, the show's opening song is there, and there's a number of other songs. So we had the Katya, who was the music director, who only wanted classical music initially. She ended up meeting with one of the top heavy metal musicians named Sasha, who she was terrified to meet him. I mean, in Soviet times, these two people would never be meeting. But she was brave, and when she came back, she said, from meeting him, she said, you know, we have children the same age. He actually studied classical music, and she became a huge champion for all the various musicians who created music. And the music on this show is excellent. I mean, it is something that you would hear. If I played some of the songs for you, you would not forgive me because you wouldn't be able to stop humming them. That's how good they are. So the music was great, but there was one thing that was very different in terms of culture from the U.S. And an example of that is the auditions that we were holding for the children to cast them. And we brought 1,200 kids together from all over the former Soviet Union. And it was a very appealing job because the salary which we were paying, which was not very much, could support a family of 4 for a year. So we had a lot of families coming. And this was my favorite time, you know, to hear the children singing. And the chief director, we took over the Gorky Film Studio, audition room that they held. And the kids were separated in 2 different areas, so they couldn't hear each other. And when the first little boy came in, he announced that he was going to sing a song, and he stood. He said, "I'm going to stand," and then his voice dropped several octaves, and he sang out this song that went something like this: "The planet is burning, everything is lost." And it was a song from Belaruski Vokzal, Belaruski train station, which was from World War II. And I thought, that's an odd song to sing for a children's comedy show. And then the next little girl comes in, and the director pats the little boy on the head, and he goes off. And the little girl says, "I'm going to sing a song called Katusha." And this is a song about a young woman who bids her lover goodbye as she goes as he goes off to the front. So this goes on all morning, and I'm just apoplectic by this time. I'm thinking, is this the music we're going to have for the show? And then at lunchtime, I asked the director, "What's with all these sad songs?" And he says to me, "These songs are not sad, Natasha. They're lyrical. They're poetic." He says, "These are the songs that the children sing with their grandmothers that give them comfort." So he decides that we are going to have as a motif some of these sad songs. And you'll have to read in the book what happens with this, but it's a running, it's just a incredible saga of what happens with these lyrical segments. But it leads to the music in this TV series really being phenomenal.
What was the public reaction to the show, and is the show still on the air?
The show is not on the air anymore. It ended in 2010, and it was a huge hit. If you speak to Russians now who you meet, or Ukrainians, anybody from the former Soviet Union, they will have heard of the show. And when I went back in January and I met these women in their 20s who were checking me in, and I asked them if did they remember the show, and they just started squealing like, yes, and they, I love Zeli Boba. And it was, an amazing contribution to changing the country, I think.
Yes, you talked about the girl puppet. I think her name was the puppet's name Katya? Katya?
Businka.
Busika, as being groundbreaking in the depiction of girls and women. And how so?
We had many discussions among the screenwriters and the rest of the creative team, and there were many generational disputes about LGBTQ questions and also about gender related to stereotypes of women. A lot of the older people wanted the female Muppet to be docile and listen to the male Muppet, you know, as far as taking direction, and didn't want the girl Muppet to be shown playing sports, for instance. So the younger screenwriters, and one of the promises I made to myself when I was asked to lead this production was to hire women in key positions, key technical positions. And we did that. We were quite dominant. So these younger women's, group of women, they said, we don't want to repeat the stereotypes, you know, that we've lived with all of our lives. Let's change this with her. So she became this fiery, mischievous character who loves to play soccer, and for some reason they decided that she had to dance the lambada. I explain why. It has to do with that was incredibly popular at the time in Moscow. But she is definitely a very not Western. She's very Russian in her characteristics, but she's a type of woman that's very strong, type of Muppet woman, female Muppet.
Yeah, I had a question. I'm sure the kids learned to enjoy the puppets and maybe even enjoyed watching TV. Was there any effort to measure what they learned?
There is. There's, research is always a component of Sesame Street and has been since its inception. And we tested the segments along the way, in some cases with a couple thousand children. And there's a lot about that in the book, too, because what was quickly discovered is that the methodology that was used for testing in the US was not going to work in Russia. We use a camera, and the researchers are measuring eyes on screen, and they're logging for attention, and then they interview the children and they test for, what has been learned. Has the goal been internalized and learned? But in Russia, the research director quite brilliantly discovered that when they put the camera in the room with the adults, that the children would just sit there stone-faced and obedient with their hands in their laps, and they would not react to the show at all. So she says, why don't we try it where we take the adults out of the room? Let's just have the cameras there and no adults. So we did that, and everything changed. And that was just, quite a success. But yes, everything was monitored, and particularly what was most fascinating were the lyrical segments that we filmed. And when those were tested with children, that result was incredible and changed how we were doing the music for the show.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and it's just wonderful.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
All right. I think we have to say goodnight to the Zoom audience, and thank you so much for being part of our festival. We hope you will come in person if you can, and keep coming on Zoom if you can come on Zoom for next year. It's been wonderful having this set of events and having Natasha Lance Rogoff. Thank you, and we're going to end this program for now.